We are live.
A very good evening to all our participants and viewers. Myself, Debashmita Majumdar, research scholar at IIT Bombay. On behalf of our eSchool team, I would like to welcome you all for the 12th and the last day of our eSchool of Climate Science and Policy, organized by IDP in Climate Studies, IIT Bombay, and supported by DST Government of India. I hope that the previous sessions were useful and informative, and thank you for being supportive. We would like to sincerely thank all those who have attended and enthusiastically asked questions and queries for the past few days of our e-school. In case if you have missed any of the previous lectures, you can find them on our YouTube channel, that is IDP Climate Studies, IIT Bombay. Please ask your questions in the link provided below in the YouTube comment box. We will take up questions at the end of the lecture. Today we have with us Professor D. Parthasarathy. Professor Parthasarathy is a professor at Department of Humanities and Social Science, IIT Bombay. He is also an associate faculty in Interdisciplinary Program in Climate Studies, IPCC IIT Bombay, Center for Urban Studies and Engineering, IIT Bombay, and Center for Policy Studies at IIT Bombay. He has earlier worked and held visiting positions at the Australian National University, National University of Singapore, and Zentrum Moderner Orient, Berlin. He is the author of Collective Violence in the Provincial City 1997 and has co-edited Women's Self-Help Groups, Reconstruction in Socio-Economic Development in 2011 and Cleavage, Connections and Conflict in Rural, Urban and Contemporary Asia in 2013. He has carried out research projects and publications in the areas of climate vulnerability and adaptation, urban studies, law and governance, gender and development, disaster risk and vulnerability. His current research interests are on coastal transformation vulnerability, ocean conflicts and sustainable transformation, glacial lake outburst flood hazard, adaptation, and vulnerability. Today, Professor Parthasarathy will be discussing the topic on climate adaptation and transformation. We welcome you, Professor, on board, and over to you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Devasmita. And I hope I'm clearly audible.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. And I hope all the participants have been doing well in these difficult times. We very much value your participation and your interest in learning more about climate science and policy. And we look forward to your future work in whatever form in the area of climate science and policy. We hope that this series of sessions on climate science and policy has been a good learning experience for all of you. And we do welcome questions, but we also welcome expressions of interest in either our academic programs or in collaboration or partnership with us in the future. Uh, uh, this particular year, our school on climate science and policy happens to coincide also with the recent release of the IPCC's sixth assessment report. And as you all must have seen, there are very dire warnings for the future of planet Earth and its people and its ecosystems and other species. So it's fitting that this topic on climate adaptation and transformation is coming at the end, because once we learn the science part and the impacts, and then we understand what kinds of vulnerability are faced both by human and non-human systems on Earth, we need to develop strategies to decide how we can adapt or, in a more holistic manner, transform our current ways of behavior, our institutions, our governance, our technologies, our patterns of consumption, our ways of addressing problems, our technologies. So, this broader issue of transformation is something that was suggested first in the IPCC fifth assessment report and has been carried forward by many researchers, activists, uh, NGOs, governments, and others in the last 10 years or so. So, I will be speaking on climate adaptation and transformation for the next 50 minutes to 60 minutes, and then I will respond to your questions. So, let me get started. I hope the PowerPoint slide that I have shared is visible to all of you. Let me know.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. All right. So I want to start with something very fundamental because when we are talking about adaptation to climate change, or the broader concept of transformation, we are not talking about narrow solutions. How can we protect ourselves from cyclones? How can we protect ourselves from floods? What do we do when there are droughts? What kind of agricultural technologies or insurance policies do we need? How do we improve the efficiency of early warning systems for heat waves? All of these are no doubt extremely important and are of value in terms of saving lives, saving livelihoods, protecting people, reducing health impacts, and so on. But as the recent IPCC sixth assessment report shows, business as usual will not do anymore. We need uh, much bigger thinking, where, as many studies, many books are showing, we need to think about the philosophy of how human beings have transformed the world. What kind of lives are we leading? What are the kind of systems of governance, of government, of administration, of democracy that we have? How much faith should we put in technology? How do we change fundamentally people's attitudes, behavior, belief systems? So these are very deep philosophical questions as much as questions of science. And therefore, as we have seen, many countries, despite the clear scientific evidence about climate change and its impacts, there are a whole bunch of highly educated political leaders, bureaucrats, corporate leaders who still either refuse to accept that climate change is a reality and that human beings are contributing to it, or they refuse to do anything about it. Right? So, therefore, when we look at these kind of buzzwords about coping, adaptation, resilience, transformation, we need to uh, think about these concepts not simply in terms of solutions. Solutions are no doubt important, but what is the larger perspective that we should have in order to ensure that we avoid the dangers that are very imminent to the whole of planet Earth? So, resilience, adaptation, coping, these are very loosely used. Sometimes they are used narrowly. We convert them into parameters and variables and measure them. But how useful are they? How are they used by political leaders or NGOs or governments? How are they used by researchers and scholars? What is the broader vision that we need in order to address the critical challenges that climate change poses to us? And from that perspective, how do we understand these concepts? So, since this is the last session, I would also like you to go beyond the narrow thinking about climate change impacts and think about how we can transform what we are doing currently so that the real dangers that have been identified by IPCC can be addressed much more substantially and not in terms of short term benefits only. So you have already had a session on vulnerability by Professor Subhankar Karmakar. So I'm not going to repeat that, but a basic understanding of vulnerability is required before we go into adaptation. So I'm going to just spend a minute or two linking vulnerability to adaptation, and then move on to adaptation as a concept, as a theory, as a strategy, uh, and ways of ensuring that adaptation strategies are efficient. So we start with the bottom right corner, where societies, ecosystems, or any kind of systems, they are exposed to climate change related hazards. When there is exposure, if we do not know enough either about the hazard itself or about the way in which the hazard will impact us, there is uncertainty. That is, we do not know how it is going to impact us. What do we need to do to protect ourselves, our property, our assets, other species, our health? And so, what do we do in that context? We try to gain more knowledge through research. This knowledge helps us to convert uncertainty into risk. So vulnerability comes into the picture when there is risk caused by exposure to a hazard. Now, if the exposure is in a place where there are no human beings living, or no economic activity, or no buildings, transportation, energy, things of value to us, or critical ecosystems. If they are not present, then maybe the vulnerability is not so high. So we are talking about vulnerability in a context where there is clear risk to certain systems that have been identified. Now, in order to reduce that vulnerability, we try to develop adaptation strategies. A very simple example would be that if you identify a hazard of cyclones or storms, then you build cyclone shelters or early warning systems, which is one very simple way of adapting to climate change to reduce, minimize losses of different kinds. And that adaptation itself reduces vulnerability, but it also it is done in a way in which we have developed more knowledge, better strategies in order to ensure that the risks and uncertainties are reduced. Now, when we say that we need to gather more knowledge and information to reduce, to convert uncertainty into risk, we also need to understand that once we convert uncertainty into risk, we may not always be able to manage risk effectively. This could be because of lack of financial resources, lack of the capacity to understand scientific findings, or political factors where uh, leaders are not willing to act upon that knowledge. There can be many reasons for this. The absence of technology to design solutions. There can be many reasons for this. Right? So adaptation, therefore, is about reducing vulnerability, managing risk with the help of different coping strategies, one of which includes enhancing what is called adaptive capacity. Now, what is the difference between adaptation, coping, resilience, adaptive capacity? What do these different concepts mean? I'll come to in just a few minutes. So we are saying vulnerability is not exposure. Vulnerability doesn't happen just because you are exposed to a hazard, just because risk exists. Vulnerability exists also because we have less adaptive capacity for a variety of reasons. Right? So if you look at the east coast of India, which is frequently struck by cyclones, for example, before the year 2000, some of you may know of the 1999 super cyclone which hit Orissa. Our systems, we were not very, we didn't have adaptive capacity. So there used to be huge amount of loss of property, animals, human beings, health impacts. But we have improved the adaptive capacity so much that there has been a huge decline in the number of deaths, especially, and loss of livestock, loss of property, and so on. So that is one way in which the exposure remains, but the vulnerability has been reduced by enhancing adaptive capacity. So this is an example where endogenously from within there was vulnerability because we were not very well prepared to an external shock. We addressed or reduced this vulnerability by improving the adaptive capacity. And therefore, the IPCC definition of vulnerability, which is the most well known, when it is defined, it includes exposure, it includes to what extent we are like a system is likely to be affected, and the degree, the development of adaptive capacity. That is the ability of a system to adjust to climate change related hazards and risks. Right? So adaptation then is an integral part of the definition of vulnerability itself. However, this was not always the case. So in the fifth assessment report of the IPCC in 2014, for example, if you look at this diagram, I'm not going to explain this in detail because it must have been shown to you already. So it's a very well-known diagram. You can see that exposure is there, vulnerability is there, hazards are there, all of which contribute to risks. And we're talking about risks emanating on the left side from climate change, on the right side from the socioeconomic systems, because we are not very well prepared, or we don't have adaptive capacity, we don't have the resources, governments are not interested, and so on. This has been, we also see this in certain older definitions of risk, which talk about hazard, vulnerability, exposure, but no adaptation, right? It's not included in these definitions. In the fourth IPCC assessment report, that was the first time that adaptation was even included and discussed in a serious way because before that we were talking only about mitigation and vulnerability. By 2007, scientists and other academics researchers had recognized that whatever we do, even if we manage to completely bring down all emissions, we have zero emission, even then there will be certain kinds of hazards. So it is important to focus on adaptation. Of course, they were more pragmatic, more realistic. They recognize that human beings are not going to be able to meet those targets of mitigation, and therefore we have to be prepared to protect ourselves from the climate change related hazards. And therefore adaptation was brought in 2007, but it was brought in such a way that it was not very useful in terms of developing adaptation strategies. So it did not make a clear distinction between what is the impact of climate change and vulnerability. Just because a cyclone strikes doesn't mean that everybody living there is vulnerable. They may be able to protect themselves through various ways. And the second point here, which is very important for India especially, the focus was much more on increase in temperature, whereas as you must have learned by now in the last couple of weeks, for South Asia and the Indian subcontinent in particular, the risks are also from not just changes in temperature, but changes in the Indian summer monsoon, which is hugely important for the Indian economy, for agriculture. It can lead to floods. It's very important for industry, for mining, for economic sector, for drinking water, and so on. So it was very important to have regional kinds of assessments so that we develop much more better designed strategies of adaptation. And that was not possible with the way in which adaptation was looked at about 15 years ago. That is why this is not yet published, but in the latest IPCC Assessment Report 6, they have attempted to address these kinds of criticisms which I just outlined by also including what is called as response, which is given the bottom right. That response is adaptation. That human beings are knowledgeable beings. They have the capacity to understand, to carry out research, to design strategies. So just because there is exposure to a hazard, it doesn't mean that they are vulnerable and they are at risk. They also develop strategies. They respond to it in many different ways. And that response or adaptive capacity determines what is the nature of the risk, whether it is more or it is less. It determines how well we are able to address these risks. I hope I'm still audible. Just checking in between to ensure I've not dropped out. Can one of you type in the chat? Yeah. Uh, yeah.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Devasmita, am I audible?
Yes, sir, yes, sir.
All right, all right. Now, this kind of understanding of incorporating adaptation into the framework of linking vulnerability, risk, and hazard is also found in much recent discussions about what is called as compound risk, where, as you can see, there is a much more complex understanding of climate change on the left side and a much more complex understanding of socioeconomic processes, where we are not just talking about uh, human beings contributing negatively to climate change, that is adverse impacts, but human beings also do positive things. They try to manage risk. They try to um, uh, go in for change their cropping patterns to adapt to drought conditions. They may reduce emissions so that the increase in temperature, the contribution to global emissions is less. They change systems of governance by bringing in new rules, new laws, new economic incentives, new kind of institutions like new ministries, departments of climate change, and so on. And they also adapt. So you have these different things that are happening in every country, in every region. On the other hand, we are talking about risk not just in terms of climate change. We are talking about compound risk because multiple kinds of risks are coming together to make people more vulnerable. So we have seen this in the last 1.5 years, where in addition to climate change and other kinds of disasters and risks, we also have the pandemic. So we ourselves have been doing some of this research in Mumbai and other places where we see communities are affected by multiple disasters. While the pandemic is going on, they're also affected by a climate, by a cyclone, by floods, by many other kinds of disasters. So there's a cascading impact one after the other on these communities, which puts them at extreme risk, which is referred to as compound risk. They're also part of the literature where we look at what is called as compound disasters, which some of you may be interested in. Therefore, we are saying that as we are likely to face more and more hazards from climate change, as the intensity of the impact of climate related hazards or the shocks are likely to increase, they go from mild to severe on the x axis, we also need more changes. Okay, the response that we have to climate change related hazards has to change. If the impact is very mild, we can perhaps absorb that. If the drought is once in 15 years, we can absorb it. If extreme rainfall is once in 100 years, we can absorb that impact. But now these so-called 100-year, once in a 100-year events are happening more frequently. There are more frequent droughts. The heat waves keep happening almost every year. So we also have to change the adaptive capacity, and therefore initially policymakers were talking about incremental change, how to increase our capacity to cope with climate change. But as the IPCC sixth assessment report shows, we have gone beyond that need for adaptive capacity because the intensity of stresses and shocks is not moderate, it has become more severe now, as we are seeing almost every day reading in the newspapers. So that means the response has to be what is given here as transformative. That is, you need much more holistic change in everything from technology to knowledge generation to teaching to institutions, governance, laws, consumption patterns. Everything has to change. Right? And therefore, when we are looking at communities, groups, economic sectors which are badly affected by climate change, we have to think of different ways in which we can respond. So we are going beyond what is described in the literature in earlier times as ASP or SRSP, different kinds of social protection. So as we are going beyond the short term to say that these kind of short term measures can help people to bounce back, maybe give them, restore their livelihoods, give them food, give them housing. But if we have to prevent recurring incidents of these kinds of disasters and long term impacts, we have to go beyond uh, short-term responses to an immediate shock or a stressor to focus on what is called as adaptive social protection. That is, ensure that people themselves are able to understand the risks they face and come up with strategies themselves. So I'm going to come back to this point later, where when we talk about transformation, it is not just transformation from above by scientists and governments. It involves what is called as co-production of knowledge. So this adaptive social protection involves people themselves developing a substantial interest in gaining knowledge about climate, about agriculture, about floods, about heat waves, and then coming up with systems or strategies to address these. Okay, that is what we refer to as adaptive social protection, for which we nowadays use the word transformation, and I'll come back to that later in this talk. Okay, so with that introduction, let me come to adaptation as a concept, as a strategy, as an approach, as a perspective, and how to measure it, how to ensure it is effective. And then in the last 5 or 10 minutes, I'll talk about transformation. So we are today talking about climate change, not just natural climate change, because climate has always been changing. We're talking about human impacts on climate, which is creating substantial risks both for human beings and for non-human natural species. Now, human beings over the last few decades, in understanding these risks from climate change, have developed two kinds of responses or strategies. The first one is mitigation, that is, reduce emissions, and the second one is adaptation. So, mitigation is essentially to reduce global climate change by reducing the emissions, as I've mentioned, whereas adaptation is to find out why certain systems, whether these are natural systems or human systems, economic systems, why are they vulnerable, and what can we do to reduce that vulnerability. Or this part is also important in adaptation, though I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Climate change can also bring about certain new opportunities. So, in very cold areas where it is difficult to grow crops because of frost, with global warming, it may become possible to start agriculture in those areas. So, that's an example of how you can actually exploit opportunities given by climate change in certain areas. But usually, we mostly talk about the harm that climate change causes to human systems. So, the two basic concepts we work with are adaptation and adaptive capacity. So, adaptation refers to whatever response or adjustment that we human systems provide to different kinds of impacts of climate change, whether these are heat waves or cyclones, floods, droughts, sea level rise, and so on, so that it can help to reduce the harm, or, like I mentioned earlier, to help us to gain from the beneficial opportunities of climate change in certain parts of the world, very few parts. Okay, so we talk about different kinds of adaptation. That is, you can do research and say that these are the risks that we are going to face in the future, and based on that, you can anticipate and ensure that you are well prepared for it. For example, by changing the cropping pattern, by putting in place cyclone shelters, robust early warning systems, heat wave warning systems, and so on. Or it can be reactive, that after a disaster occurs from a climate change hazard, you learn lessons from it and then put in place adaptation mechanisms. It can also be private in the sense it can be individual or household, it can be by companies, it can be by an institution. For example, offshore oil companies, in order to protect themselves from severe weather events, will change their infrastructure in such a way that they are not harmed by these extreme weather events. Right? Or it can be public, that is, the government plays an important role. Right? Whereas the adaptive capacity is something that we think about, that is, to what extent does a system have the ability to adjust. This system can be a city, it can be a state, it can be a country, it can be the planet as a whole, it can be a particular economic sector, it can be the infrastructure sector, it can be the energy sector, it can be agriculture, it can be an ecosystem where human beings don't live. Right? So we're talking about different kinds of systems and what capacity they have to adjust to climate change. This capacity can be uh, auto internal, that is, it can be for certain kind of species, non-human species, they may have the genetic potential to naturally adapt to climate change, but most don't. So this system, when we talk about the ability, talk about financial resources, knowledge resources, the right kind of values and attitudes, the willingness to go with facts and evidence and not with falsehoods. All of these indicate something about the ability of a system to adjust to climate change. That is what we refer to as adaptive capacity. Very briefly, I will talk about the difference between mitigation and adaptation. You have already had a session on mitigation. So you can see here that when we are talking about what different strategies for mitigation versus adaptation, uh, the mitigation of climate change, it usually targets all systems. That is, we need to bring down emissions from all sectors, whereas adaptation is usually for particular systems. That is, adaptation can be for coastal zones, adaptation can be for agriculture, adaptation can be for protection from heat waves. So it's for particular systems that we are talking about. And once we try to mitigate climate change, it benefits the whole planet, whereas adaptation usually benefits a particular region, a particular city, a particular locality where there is risk of sea level rise or flooding or storm surge or something else. Um, the impact of mitigation is long lasting. So, if you bring down emissions, the benefits for the world at large can be for several centuries, whereas adaptation, you constantly have to keep changing, as I will show a little later. Um, in response to changing climatic systems, natural or anthropogenic, in response to changing risk patterns, that the risk may actually increase, new kinds of hazards may emerge. So, if you put in place an adaptation system now, it may work for the next 5 years, it may work for the next year, 10 years, but it may not work for a long time because we may have faced new risks, new hazards. Right? And also, if there is something like a cyclone shelter, for example, it has a short life. So you may have to reconstruct it, rebuild it after some years, right? So we need to constantly keep changing. The actual benefits from mitigation, it takes time for us to get those benefits once emissions start reducing. Whereas with adaptation, you can actually get the benefits immediately and it can last for a long time. uh, on the other hand, the science, current science that we have, it shows that once you bring down greenhouse gas emissions, the benefits are very clear, they're very certain. With adaptation, we are not so sure. So you may change your cropping pattern because of changes in the onset and retreat of the monsoon. But it may work, it may not work, because there are too many other factors to be considered from soil. We cannot exactly predict when the monsoon will set, when it will go, how much of rainfall you'll get in a particular year, and so on. There can be insects, there can be pests. The market may change for that particular product. So the benefits are not as certain as they are with mitigation. Um, with mitigation, we may not have other kinds of benefits because you have to incur a cost to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. Whereas with adaptation, we see a lot of other benefits in terms of lives saved, in terms of health benefits, less expenditure on health, in terms of reducing the number of days lost to disasters. You can build schools to also work as cyclone shelters. So then the same money can be used to create infrastructure, which can give different kinds of benefits and so on. In terms of payment, who pays for this kind of strategies? The polluter pays usually. The companies which emit, the organizations which emit, they have to pay for it, or individuals. Whereas with adaptation, that's not necessarily true. It can be communities which are affected by it which pay for it. It could all, but usually it's government agencies which try to put in place adaptation mechanisms, because this is a public good. Okay? And therefore, what we say is that the actual benefits from mitigation, reduction of emissions, will go to the whole world, not just to a particular company or an individual who reduces emissions. Whereas with adaptation, irrespective of who pays for it, a lot of other people benefit from it. Therefore, from this we can see that mitigation and adaptation are complementary. Both are required to address climate change related challenges, but sometimes they can also work at cross purposes. One example given here is that if you plant trees to provide additional shade, there are interesting studies in India, including in Bangalore, which show how heat waves can be reduced, especially for people working on the streets, living on the streets during the daytime, if you plant more trees. And trees also help to mitigate because they can absorb carbon. But if you use air conditioning, which is also an adaptation strategy when you are facing heat waves, it actually contributes to emissions and can contribute to rising temperatures. So they are working at, they are conflicting with each other. Therefore, these are political choices that we have to make, and therefore they are difficult choices. It's not easy to decide which strategy to follow, but we must be aware that they have different kinds of impacts or consequences. These are other examples. So you had an inaugural session with Professor Subimal Ghosh, our convener in the beginning of this e-school. So his work along with some of his students have shown that while we can increase irrigation as a way of adaptation for farmers when droughts are increasing, his research shows, for example, that increased irrigation and surface water can actually provide feedback to the atmosphere and can cause extreme precipitation events and localized precipitation events in particular areas. So it can actually contribute to climate change and extreme weather events. Likewise, to prevent flooding and sea level rise and storm surge, they have built sea walls or river walls in different parts of India and different parts of the world, but they only push up the floods to other parts of that region, or they cause vertical erosion along the coast. So they are not really suitable adaptation measures in the long run. They can actually contribute to increasing hazards. Again, this is something that I'm just putting up here. We don't have enough time to go into each one in detail, but since this is an introductory session on adaptation, I felt that those of you who are interested in knowing more about this at least should be aware of these concepts. So when we talk about adaptation, we must be aware of those factors which uh, either enhance adaptation or reduce adaptation, enhance vulnerability or reduce vulnerability. And therefore, concepts like sensitivity, susceptibility, that is the difference between whether a system is affected or not in response to a hazard, to what extent, to what degree damage is caused, is it always damage, are there positive benefits, extent to which a system remains stable even after being hit by a hazard, how quickly it can bounce back, okay, how, what is the capacity of that system to ensure that they don't become vulnerable to a hazard, how flexibly, what kind of flexibility is there to change rules, regulations, to change policies, to change institutions, to devote more resources to research. All of these will overall determine the adaptation and adaptive capacity, and therefore, in actual strategies, in the actual design of adaptation strategies, about which I'll talk a little later, we have to consider all of these different factors. Now, the human adaptation to climate change is not something that is very well defined, precisely because it is so complex, as I have explained here. Right? So there can be so many different kinds of adaptation activities, and I gave you a simple example earlier. If the temperatures are increasing, either like we have in IIT Bombay campus, you just enter through the main gate into the campus, you can see the temperature dropping by a couple of degrees, right? So when a particular area is green, there are a lot of trees. Naturally, it's one way of adaptation to bring down the temperatures, or you can use air conditioning, which is not a very good way of adapting to increasing heat waves. So we have many different kinds of adaptation activities or strategies, and these are determined by whether that particular sector is affected by climate change or not. So certain sectors, like I've given here, agriculture, forestry, may be affected, coastal areas. Certain sectors may not be so much affected by climate change. It also depends on what kind of climate hazards, whether these are sea level rise, droughts, um, increase in sea surface temperature, heat waves, storms and cyclones. Depending on that, we can decide what kind of adaptation we need. But it also depends on knowledge. So science is important to increase the predictability and impacts of climate change, because in the absence of that, many governments around the world tend to say that we cannot really attribute this phenomenon to climate change, we are not able to predict it well, therefore we will not do anything, we cannot do anything, it's all, they attribute it to god, to nature and so on, and they use them as excuses not to do anything. So science is important here to put in place good adaptation strategies. Of course, non-climatic conditions are also important, because like I've said earlier, what kind of political leaders we have, what kind of belief systems we have, whether we have good governments to understand and do something about climate change, whether the economic system is robust, is strong to withstand the effects of climate change, all of these also determine how adaptation can happen. So you need financial resources, you need knowledge, you need government agencies who are sensitive to climate change, right? All of good leadership is required. And of course, in certain societies we have seen that they spontaneously decide to do something, for example, reduced physical activity during a heat wave, or you can also plan out to do something in terms of adaptation. For example, India has building codes, which tell us uh, how buildings should be faced, what kind of ventilation should be there, which direction should be the windows and doors. Most buildings may not follow this, but these are there to provide natural cooling, to reduce thermal impacts during heat waves, all of these. So we can actually have this, and we also have a lot of new kinds of paints which reflect heat rather than absorb them. Right? What kind of building material you use, all of these also can help us as adaptation strategies. And I've already talked to you about how adaptation can be reactive or anticipatory. And depending on what kind of knowledge we have, we can plan far ahead into the future, next 50 years, or we can plan for the next year, next couple of years, and so on. And of course, adaptation can be technical, institutional. We can put in place laws. For example, just like in you have mitigation laws to like the Bharat emission norms, Euro emission norms. You also have building codes for adaptation. Right? So you can, and government of India has mandated that awareness about environment should be introduced in schools, in colleges, and so on through EVS, through environmental studies courses. So you can have rules, regulations, laws, policies. So the adaptation can take the form of many different. It can take many different forms, and of course, uh, it's not enough if only government agencies are involved in adaptation. Everyone has to get involved. The more different forms of organizations are involved, the better the efficiency of adaptation. Now, all of this means that there are so many different approaches for adaptation and so many different methodologies. So, how do we ensure that the kind of adaptation strategy we design actually meets the needs, is efficient, and there are no barriers to its implementation? Okay. So, for that, there are certain aspects that we need to consider, especially considering present conditions today, that we have to accept modern science, which says that the climatic changes are unprecedented. It has never happened on this scale earlier. Not avoid it, not ignore it, not neglect it, not explain it away. Accept that this is happening. We also need to accept that the rate of change is very rapid, which means it's not going to affect us 100 years later or 50 years later after we are no longer here. It's happening today, it's happening tomorrow, it's happening day after tomorrow. But at the same time, an advantage that we have is that we have a huge amount of knowledge, huge amount of information to help us design better strategies. But we need to make use of this knowledge, not like certain political leaders around the world who don't want to use this knowledge or who even deny the existence of climate change. But it also means that the task of doing this research is very difficult. So, Professor Subimal Ghosh and others have talked about how the need for downscaling models, regional models, because the kind of understanding that we have at the global level may not be very useful for Maharashtra, for Rajasthan, for Odisha, or whatever. So, you need local, regional, downscale models, and the complexity, the uncertainty, the fact that climate is changing all the time, it's very dynamic. These are all not very easy for us to understand, not very easy for us to do research on or interpret, and then forget even about converting them into policies and strategies, which is even more difficult, right? So that is why we need more and more people to get into climate change science and policy. uh, that also means that it's not enough if academics or scientists alone do research on this. We need to bring in more people to understand climate change and respond to it, from healthcare providers to tourism managers to transporters, people working in energy sector, in industry, forestry, urban planners, hydrologists. Everybody needs to play a role. And some of our research in our group, for example, have shown very clearly that the failure of the meteorologists to include hydrologists in the planning process actually leads to miscommunication and the occurrence of floods whenever there are extreme precipitation events, for example. Okay, which also means that we need to think about all kinds of measures, not just what we did earlier. Okay, very simplistic methods like cyclone shelter for adapting to cyclones, or staying at home during heat waves. We have to think about all kinds of measures to help us cope with the unprecedented climate change hazards. Now, I'll give you an example of how we then, in practice, proceed to think about adaptation in the context of this kind of dynamic changes, uncertainty, and rapid and unprecedented changes in weather patterns. Okay, so this is a hypothetical time series where we are taking the example of rainfall during the monsoon season. What you can see here is that in time t1, there is a particular uh, the rainfall is normal, but in T2 there is an extreme precipitation event which can lead to flooding. So there have been, as you can see, before T1, there have been extreme rainfall events as well as frequent droughts below. But these are many years apart. After T1, you can see the frequency of extreme rainfall events, extreme precipitation events is increasing. So after T2, a particular community or a society or a city affected, or a rural area affected by this extreme event may put in place certain mechanisms to prevent flooding or protect their crops. But as the extreme events keep happening year after year, every 2 years, every year, that may no longer be enough. It goes beyond their capacity to cope, right? Or even the first time it happens in T2, they may just take insurance. They may just use some of their savings to get back, to bounce back. But that may not be enough because it keeps happening year after year. There is crop damage, there is damage to their houses, loss of life of the earning member, and all that. So that kind of coping mechanism is not enough anymore. They need to do something more, right? So when the coping range extends substantially, causing significant damage year after year, they need to do something else. And therefore, it shows that when climate change, the climate variable is increasing and it exceeds the coping capacity, they may also decide to extend their coping range upwards, which is where adaptation comes in. And here an example is given of how to prevent flooding from frequent extreme rainfall events. They may build a new overflow reservoir. As more and more extreme events occur, E2, E3, and so on, there may be more and more damage. So constantly you have to keep thinking about how to protect yourself. Maybe finally they have to move out of this place, which is also an adaptation strategy. Right? Yeah. So what we learn from this is that adaptation is not a one-time event. It's not a one-time strategy that solves the problem perennially for all time, permanently, but it is something where needs arise all the time, and therefore you have to. It's a dynamic process where constantly you have to be proactive, anticipating what are likely to be the effects and preparing for them much in advance. Okay. And therefore, when you talk about the strategy or the mechanism for designing an adaptation strategy, these are the different steps in an adaptation mainstreaming cycle. That is, mainstream it into everything that you do, whether it's a factory that you're running, whether it's a transportation organization which runs buses or trains, whether it's an energy company. Okay, everything you have to mainstream it into the way in which you do carry out your everyday activities. So you start with trying to understand what are the climate related hazards, what is the climate system, how is it changing, what are the vulnerabilities, and to step 2. Step 3, identify what can we do. So do we reduce do we put in place do we use air conditioning to protect ourselves from heat waves? Do we change the design of buildings? Do we give holidays to people during extreme heat waves? Or do we do something else? Choose these different options and then select one or two which are most likely to be successful. It also depends on other factors, whether we have enough money, which one is more expensive, which one is cheaper, which one can last for the longer term, and then finally implement it. After implementation, assess whether this is actually working in terms of meeting our adaptation needs or not. So it can be put in a different format here, where you carry out research, do literature review, um, and then find out what are the kind of climate change related hazards, how are we vulnerable, identify certain adaptation options, find out which are likely to work for us in a particular sector or a particular region, then find out who are the people who should be involved, which institutions, which organizations, what technologies do we need, what knowledge do we need, how much resources do we need, how much of finance we need, whether we need to change rules and laws, and then formulate the strategy and start implementing it. Yeah. So essentially what we are saying is an adaptation measure is something that is necessary to help us minimize losses due to climate change. So we need to know what kind of adaptation measure will work. So if, for example, if you want farmers to change their cropping pattern because the monsoon rainfall is changing, the Indian monsoon is changing, do they have the knowledge to change the cropping pattern? Is there a market for these crops? Is there additional expense to change the cropping pattern? Does it require additional labor? Does it require new kinds of learning, new knowledge? All of these we need to assess before we zero in on a particular strategy, which is why an analytical framework is required to decide, to find out which adaptation strategy will work, which will not work. Yeah. So to give you some examples here, just talking about farmers' adaptation to climate change. So they can, so you have at least 15-20 options here, right? They can do so many different things. They can change crops, change the variety, because within, if they're growing rice, there can be another rice variety which requires less water, or they can shift to jowar or bajra, which requires less water, drought proof crops. Or they can shift from farming to livestock management, farming to non-farming. If livestock are facing water shortage, they can shift to agriculture crops which require less water. They can migrate, or they can just choose to do nothing, or they can use insurance, like we have government policies, Bima Fasal Yojana, for example, insurance for crop loss. Right? So there are so many different things that they can do in order to ensure that they adapt to climate change. Which one you choose depends on many different factors. So you have to define what is meant by utility here is that you have to define what kind of benefits we can get, what kind of adverse impacts are there by choosing a particular option from these many choices given to us. Okay? So these are just more examples. I'm not going to go into them in detail. You can look it up. So if climate change is going to affect water resources, what can we do to increase water supply? What can we do to reduce water demand? If soil erosion is going to be a problem because of climate change, how can we reduce this soil erosion? If fisheries are going to be affected, how can we help to ensure that fish species are not vulnerable, because fish species are also economically very important. They're very important for food security. What can we do to protect the environments, ecosystems, habitats which harbor these fish species? Or health impacts are one of the major ones from climate change, whether these are from heat waves or cyclones or extreme events, floods. And health impacts can be because of vector-borne diseases. So we know that with changes in temperature and humidity levels, there can be more epidemics from insect-borne diseases, malaria, dengue, H1N1, all of these kind of things. So how do we adapt ourselves to mitigate or reduce the risks and impacts from these human health impacts of climate change? Likewise, with coastal zones, which are very vulnerable to different kinds of climate change impacts, from sea level rise and coastal erosion to storm surge and cyclones. With similarly with agriculture and food security, which are likely to be affected by climate change, as well as other ecosystems like parks, reserves, national parks, okay, the species which are very important for the survival of the planet. All of these have to be thought of when we design adaptation strategies in these different sectors. We also need to keep another aspect in mind here. Okay, so in order to ensure that a particular adaptation strategy that you have chosen is successful, we have to find out what are the likely to be the benefits, what are what is likely to be an adverse impact. Therefore, if you see the fourth column there, it tells us what kind of adverse impacts may occur if you choose a particular option. So if agriculture is going to be adversely impacted by climate change, and you want to uh, enhance drought resistance, that is, you want crops to yield more or maintain their yield even in the face of droughts. Therefore, one adaptation option you may go for is to use GMOs, genetically modified crops, or biotechnology. But a lot of scientific research also shows that while genetically modified crops may help us develop drought-proofed varieties, they may also have long-term impacts on the ecology and on other species. So similarly, we have listed different kinds of adverse impacts for different kinds of adaptation options we choose, whether it is so to enhance drinking water availability, for example, we can go for desalination. But desalination requires a lot of money. It requires a lot of energy use. Right? Uh, Likewise, if you, I have already given you this example of coastal protection. If you build seawalls, again there are a lot of costs. There's a lot of corruption involved in them. But also we see that they adversely impact coastal wetlands, and we are already seeing them in Bombay, where the National Green Tribunal and the high courts have come down strongly on the government agencies for building these seawalls, saying they are ecologically very destructive. Right? So that this is a very important aspect when we design adaptation strategies. Um, this is something that I've already covered. Let me skip this. I'll just give you a couple of examples and then I'll move to the last part of my presentation. So this is an example of what is required for efficient adaptation, uh, where this is a study that was done for Maharashtra, but it's a general kind of diagram that talks about what are the different things that we need to do for adaptation. It involves governance, that how people have to be involved in making decisions about coping with the impacts of a climate related hazard, whether it's a flood or a climate change. It talks about ecosystem based adaptation. So if, for example, we need to protect mangroves or coastal wetlands as a way of mitigating the risk of storm surge, sea level rise, salinity intrusion, or flood mitigation, then you need people living along the coastal areas to also be part of it. Okay. At the same time, the people who are going to be adversely impacted by this climate change hazards, if you protect mangroves, if you protect wetlands, people who are dependent on them, can we give them alternative livelihoods? If people who are living along these areas have to be displaced, to create more what are called as bioshields, that is vegetation to prevent storm surges and their impacts. What can we do to reduce vulnerability of these people living along these coastal areas? And how do we ensure that the ecosystems are maintained, their health is maintained? So all of these different things have to be incorporated in an efficient adaptation strategy for a coastal area, as an example. Or if you look at this, Chandni Singh gave a talk in IIT Bombay yesterday in one of our workshops. She is one of the lead authors for the IPCC, focusing especially on adaptation in Indian cities. And she talks about the preference for different kinds of strategies and the use of different components in creating an adaptation strategy, right from creating evidence to consultation processes, ensuring that everybody is on board, ensuring that we think about what are the adverse impacts, and but also what are the barriers, which could be financial, which could be political, which could be governmental, all of these things. So this is from a review which talks about the different things, components that have to go into developing an adaptation strategy, and discussion with experts which tells us about what are the important things which should go into an adaptation strategy. Right? So based on this, we can then decide how to develop an efficient strategy, whether it is for flooding or sea level rise or a heat wave or something else. All right. I'm just going to spend the next few minutes talking about transformation. So we have been talking about adaptation, but gradually over the last 10-15 years, both researchers as well as policymakers, and with a push from IPCC, but also a lot of environmental activists, NGOs, and others, they have been saying that adaptation is no longer a useful concept. We should think of transformation. So it is seen in some of these IPCC fifth assessment reports, for example, and it's also incorporated into the latest sixth assessment report. So they talk about pathways to transformation or transformation pathways. Now, this kind of approach has emerged because we felt that earlier concepts like resilience, coping, adaptation, these are not very useful, and they are in fact misused. Just to take an example from our own research, in Mumbai, for example, the government and political leaders, whenever there is flooding or an extreme event, there is a lot of damage, they will just say we can't do anything. Mumbai people are very resilient. There is a spirit of Bombay. They will help each other. It is an act of God. And one government official, in fact, even disaster management official said, this year there was flooding, but no one needed to be rescued, so we cannot call it a flood, right? So we fail to understand that people are helping themselves. They're resilient because they have no choice, because they're not getting help from the government or from somebody else. So resilience indicates a stability, it indicates a status quo. It doesn't mean it is necessarily good, right? So it becomes a problem to celebrate resilience because it can be out of lack of choice. People just don't have any help, any support, and therefore they are resilient. But that resilience comes at a cost. They are not able to plan for the future. They are not able to invest in education, in housing, in health, in so many other things, because they're all the time focused on being resilient against these stresses and shocks. And therefore they talk about not resilience, but we, in the face of disasters, in the face of hazards, we should not just be resilient, we should flourish. That is, how can we think of adaptation in such a way that it yields other benefits, what is called as co-benefits. I gave you an example earlier. So if you want to build cyclone shelters, since a cyclone is not going to happen every day, how can we use that building, that structure for other purposes? If we change the cropping pattern in response to changes in the monsoon, can we increase the income of farmers through that? Can we increase more employment through that? Can we increase food security and nutrition security, especially for children, through that? So that's why we have moved away from adaptation and resilience to transformation, where we are saying that we have to move. So initially, transition was thought of as a way in which we move from a stage where we are vulnerable to less vulnerability. But now there is this concept of risk society, which comes from Ulrich Beck, a German sociologist, which says that we all face different kinds of risk all the time. Therefore, we need systemic change. So transformation refers to systemic change and not just small scale, short term, incremental change, which means it is Ashish Kothari, an environmentalist from India. He talks about all these kinds of changes, technological changes in political systems. Okay, he talked about in the 2019 elections, for example, he wrote an article comparing the election manifesto of different parties and how they hardly focus on climate change or environmental issues. For example, for them it's not important. Caste is important, right? Religion is important for them. So all kinds of issues are important, but climate change is not important. Environment is not important. They don't talk about these things. So how can we bring about change which is long lasting? And how can we bring about this change by changing the way in which we talk about development, growth, consumption, uh, happiness, well-being, and all of these kind of things. So this is where Karen O'Brien, a well-known environmental scholar, says that this transformation, which is a deliberate process, it doesn't happen automatically. We have to consciously think about bringing this change. This happens in three spheres: the personal, at the level of individuals, how we change our opinions, our values, and how we come together to address climate change; the political sphere, how we change the laws, the rules and regulations, the ideologies, our visions of development and growth, how we change all of these, uh, and including policies, of course. And the practical is the implementation, which includes technology, the kind of institutions we have. How should institutions function, whether these are legal institutions, economic institutions, pollution control board, water management, all of these, how should these change in order to implement what we learn from the personal and the political sphere? How can you translate the changes in the political and the personal sphere into the practical sphere? So here I'm going to give you an example from research of one of our PhD students, and which is also part of one of our projects. And then I'll end with that, where we talk about how at different levels, that is from the government, the top level, the corporate sector, to the middle level, where there are local level, municipal, ward level, municipal officials, NGOs, and then the ordinary people who are affected by floods. How can they all come together to transform the way in which that particular neighborhood or region uh, reduces the risk of flooding due to extreme climate events in the city of Bombay, and how the learning from this kind of local efforts can be scaled upwards to the city, to the region, and to other regions, so that we can uh, move towards transformation and are not just talking about adaptation to every flood every year. Okay, so here what happened was, this we looked at in the Dahisar area in Bombay. There is a Dahisar river which floods every year, and a lot of people are adversely affected by it. And therefore, what we looked at was that people themselves were fed up of government not doing anything, and therefore they came together with local municipal officials, NGOs, and others, gathered knowledge about flooding, why it happens, when it happens, which parts are affected more, why are they affected more, what can we do to reduce the risk of flooding in such a way that it does not push the flooding to some other place but mitigates the risk for everyone concerned. So they first began to understand that the flooding was not just because of climate change and extreme events, it was a combination of factors from climate change, but also it was because of haphazard planning, where certain kinds of infrastructure projects were created which were actually facilitating floods because they blocked the flow of water. And they also looked at issues related to stormwater drains, how the government came up with ineffective solutions such as retaining walls or pumping stations, narrow technocratic engineering solutions. They also found out how certain low income communities were the most affected. Through this research, they then came up with strategies in the three spheres that I discussed earlier. I won't go into them in detail. I just want to point out here how, from knowledge gathering to supervision of cleaning of stormwater drains, making sure that solid waste management is efficient, repairing the houses so that they are not affected by floods, removing psychological fears, uh, changing the policies so that haphazard planning and blocking of flow of water doesn't happen. So different spheres, personal, political, and practical, they put in place solutions so that it becomes transformation and not just adaptation to the risk of flooding every year. So they took proactive measures. They interacted with political leaders and communities in all the three spheres. They tried to find out what is the time point, that is a tipping point, that is, if we keep on doing this kind of activities, how do we move beyond adaptation to transformation? That is, at what stage do we move beyond just protecting ourselves from floods to preventing the risk of flooding itself, right? So what all are required to move from adaptation to transformation? That is the tipping points that we talk about here. And then what are the conditions that are required? Okay, who prevent these strategies from being implemented? Are there barriers related to knowledge? Are there gaps? Do we need more money? Do we need more knowledge? All of these were put together to ensure that they move away from adaptation, that is short term methods, to long term change which is environmentally sustainable, a different kind of urban planning, something that is inclusive, because those who are most affected in the informal settlements in slums are helped to mitigate the risk. And also, they are now moving towards understanding future risks, right? How can we incorporate future risks so that we are better prepared for them? All of these indicate that transformation cannot happen uh, in an isolated manner. They require all of these conditions. They require different actors to come together. You have to ensure that they are just, that is, they meet the needs of all, they are equitable, they're ecologically sound, and the knowledge that is used doesn't come only from government. It also comes from local people who have a solid understanding of what problems they face. So these kind of alliances, innovative practices coming from different groups need to be put together. We need to think of what is sustainable development and not just economic growth and urban development, which actually enhances the hazards from extreme events. And we have to start locally and then upscale it to higher levels. And we have to produce knowledge together with multiple groups, NGOs, governments, scientists, all of them coming together. So this is what is thought of as transformation. And around the world, there are a number of projects which are involved in action research to ensure that this kind of transformation is happening to deal with climate change related hazards. And we ourselves in IIT Bombay are involved in some of these projects. Those of you who are interested can get in touch with us and we can provide more details. But I'm going to stop here and take some time to respond to your questions. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Now, we would like to take up some questions or comments.
Yeah.
Sir, is the first question visible on your screen?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Ashutosh, for this question. This is one of the fundamental questions that you have posed. So, in fact, the economic system which values higher and higher demands uh, and then higher and higher levels of consumption is one of the things that is driving anthropogenic climate change. So we need to move away from this kind of an economic system, which is focused exclusively on narrow ideas of growth without looking at well-being. So with different levels of, you don't need to consume just for the sake of consumption. All of us don't need to consume like the top 1% of the population. So at the same time, there are also millions and millions of people in the world who are not able to meet their basic needs. So you need an economic system which is just, which enables everyone to meet their basic needs using technologies and mechanisms which are not contributing to emissions. At the same time, these are economic systems which are not fully predicated, purely predicated on growth alone. Right? So these economic systems need to be geared to meeting people's needs. So what kind of economic systems can contribute towards that in a more efficient way? And that is where economists like Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize, have been talking about alternative kind of economic systems which can address uh, um, uh, climate change related issues. Thank you for that.
Yes. Yes, thank you, sir. Second question.
Yeah. Thank you, Swati. Thank you, and thank you also for your contribution to the presentation that I given here. So the governance systems and the planning processes. Uh, I want to talk about one particular aspect here, since we don't have enough time. One of the things that we have been discussing both at the city level as well as the national level in India is that the planning and governance related to climate change happens in silos. That is, there are multiple departments, for example, health, industry, energy, forestry, agriculture, which all need to coordinate. But unfortunately, uh, that kind of coordination is not happening, and there is what we call as a balkanization. So even with when it comes to flood mitigation, for example, different in departments are involved at the city level, from solid waste management to pollution control to disaster management cell, the urban planning authority, the water managers, the hydrologists, the meteorologists. So many different departments are involved, but there is very little coordination. So, in case of governance systems and planning process, transformation can essentially be thought of in terms of developing more linkages across scale at different levels, but also across different institutions.
Yes. So moving on to the next question.
Yeah. Thank you. This is Ms. Mamta Jain, founder Samposhan. What kind of collaborations are possible? So let me just seek research papers on negative impacts of textile waste in landfills. Thanks. I myself have not done much work on this, and but it is a very important area, and we have seen this. In fact, I've seen this. I observed this in Bombay itself, where there is a lot of informal sector textile manufacturing, and the municipal corporation in Bombay insists that it is not their job to clear the solid waste from these informal sector textile manufacturing, that their duty is only to take household waste, and a lot of it gets piled up, which prevents free flow of water in many places we've seen, and creates floods. But also landfills, and landfills, as we know, are also an important source of methane. And we've seen in Delhi how landfills are also themselves hazards, especially crashing down on slum settlements located close to them. So there is not just textile waste, but the interaction of textile waste with other kinds of waste constitute significant hazards. So at least here in IIT Bombay, I don't know of many people who have worked on this, but I do know some people in Delhi who have worked on this. So we can let you know. But there may be people working in Niri on this. But if it is something that you would like us to do research on, we work not just on the basis of funded projects, but we also have a PhD program. So either you yourself, if you want, you can join us for these kinds of for a PhD program, or if you would like some of our students to take up these projects, either for their thesis or for something else, we'd be very welcome, because apart from the climate studies group, we also have a center for urban science and engineering and a center for urban for policy studies, where master students are encouraged to take up real life projects. So we do work with NGOs, civil society organizations, and other government organizations, so that we can take up real life projects. So if you'd like, if you are interested in collaborating with us and seeking uh, research output as well as solutions for this, we'd be very happy to discuss this further.
Yes, sir. So next question is from Rangini, IIT Bombay.
Yeah, Ms. Ragini, thank you for this question. Standard method to assess compounding risk? Uh, Not yet. So the compound risks and compound disasters, they've only been we've only started research on these in the last decade or so. So it is not the same as normal risk assessment, because we are trying to look at what I referred to earlier as cascading effects. So the compounding depends not just on the different hazards that we have identified and their impacts, but the compounding also depends on the vulnerability of the communities or the sectors or the groups that we are talking about. Therefore, as of now, at least to my knowledge, the kind of research that's going on compounding risks and compounding disasters are mostly of a qualitative nature, to better understand the ways in which the risks are increasing or decreasing, and the relationship between risks and vulnerability. Uh, there may be a few studies which are quantitative and more rigorous methodologies, but as of now, to my knowledge, most of the existing research is mostly qualitative, trying to develop frameworks to better understanding the compounding effects, and trying to understand how, due to compounding effects, vulnerability increases. Right? So we are at that stage right now.
Yes. So next question is
Uh, Yeah. So, Snehal, can you tell us which? So, giving an overview will take a long time, because you've identified an issue that is, and Susan Cutter has been working on this for a long time. But uh, and, I'm not sure if there is a particular aspect of it that you want me to discover, because giving an overview is not within the purview of the time limit. But I'll just like to mention one particular aspect of resilience and vulnerability that Susan Cutter discusses, because I work with one of Susan Cutter's collaborators, and some of her earlier work on resilience, in fact, suffered from the kind of problem that I outlined earlier, that they ignored the kinds of vulnerability that were reflected in resilience. And that is one of the places where she started by talking about this vulnerability paradox. And therefore, as she and her colleagues began working more and more on resilience and vulnerability, they began to understand that there are limitations to the way in which we can measure vulnerability and resilience using indicators, especially quantitative indicators. And therefore, they moved to a more qualitative, community level understanding of vulnerability. So, as of now, I think it will be difficult for me to speak, to give you an overview, but you're very welcome to write to me, and we can discuss this in more detail later.
yes. So the next question is from Rahul Kashyap.
Yeah, thank you, Rahul. Again, natural climate variability and anthropogenic climate change. So this relates to what is called as the attribution problem. So we had a workshop yesterday where, in fact, Professor Krishna Achyutarao from IIT Delhi, who's an expert on this, was talking about this. So For example, if we take increasing in occurrence of storms and cyclones in the west coast of India, that is the Arabian Sea. So earlier we used to have frequent cyclones on the east coast in the Bay of Bengal, but not so much. Now there are increases in occurrence of cyclones in the western coast in the Arabian Sea, and Professor Sridhar Balasubramanian from IIDP in Climate Studies has been saying this can be partially attributed to the increasing sea surface temperature as well as various other factors. Okay? So there is an attribution to climate change. But he also shows, Professor Sridhar and Professor Krishna Chitrao, they also show that as yet the climate science is not perfect. As yet we don't have perfect knowledge of all the different factors that contribute to extreme events caused by climate change, especially in coastal areas along the Arabian Sea. So there is a definite increase in cyclones and storm surges. There is a definite increase in sea level rise. To what extent can we attribute them to natural climate change? To what extent can we attribute them to anthropogenic? So, at a global level, we can definitely say that anthropogenic climate factors do contribute to increase in temperature, increasingly erratic weather patterns, and so on. But particular events, okay, in particular years or seasons, to attribute them to climate change is as yet very difficult. Yeah.
So the next question is again from Mumta Jain.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Ms. Mumta Jain. Yeah, so when the positive outlook is usually done with reference to particular regions of the world. For example, in extremely cold areas, uh, whether in Russia or even in India, in close to the Himalayas, as some of you may have read even in the media, that the vegetation is being observed in the Himalayas, and Devasmita probably knows more about this also, at higher ranges also in the Himalayas, which was not there earlier, right? This is because of the warming in those areas. So there is possibility of agriculture. There's a very interesting BBC documentary that I watched about how, because of climate change, there is this particular variety of grapes which are used to produce something called ice wine. This is from frozen grapes, which they are not able to grow in France, Germany, Russia anymore because of climate change. But China is able to grow them in particular places, taking advantage of climate change in their own areas. So, uh, in the Himalayan region, for example, because of the frost factor, certain crops we cannot grow in winter, but because of climate change, because of warming, those areas we are able to start cultivating. So we are not talking about a positive outlook as such. What we are saying is that there are opportunities that are made available in certain parts of the world because of climate change. As yet, we do not know if these will sustain for the long term or the short term. We also do not know what is going to be the impact on the ecosystems of doing something in those areas which we were not doing earlier. If you start agriculture in an area where we were not practicing agriculture earlier, what is going to be its long term impact? We don't know. So, but it is important to be objective about it and see what kind of opportunities are there, while we do recognize that largely the impact is negative.
Yes. So the next question again from Mamta Jain.
Yeah. So the sea level rise, uh, this is again difficult, because yesterday again in the workshop that we had, Professor Janak Rajan from MIDS was talking about sea level rise, and there are different kinds of predictions. So sea level rise definitely is happening, but whether it's going to increase by a few inches or by 1 meter, again that depends not just on how climate change is affecting sea level rise. It's going to and this was what Professor Janak Rajan was talking about yesterday. It because the sea level rise is relative to many other factors, so it depends on what kind of coastal erosion is happening. It depends on sediment transport. It depends on shoreline change. It depends on what kind of infrastructure we have in those areas, which may affect many of the other environmental phenomena happening in that area. It depends on land subsidence in the local area, in the coastal areas, which may be because of construction areas. It may also be because of concretization, because of which the water, the aquifers are not filled, and then sinking can happen in those areas. So there are many different factors which will influence the actual extent of sea level rise. So the fact that sea level rise is happening and is going to happen is a certainty. To what extent will happen, it's still in the realm of uncertainty. Yeah, so transport culture, yeah, this is an interesting question. So moving away from private vehicles to public transport is of course one option, and you already see a very huge difference between North America and Europe. So Europe has invested much more in public transport and reducing private transport, whereas the United States, so that's why beliefs, attitudes, the personal sphere is very important. So in the US, for example, they still prefer very highly polluting, high emitting, personalized motorized vehicles. So the difference between public transport, but transportation culture can also be addressed in other ways. So there's a very interesting development in Karnataka which happened last week, where one of the ministers announced that they want to encourage a different model of urban planning, where there'll be industrial estates and along with housing in the same area, so that people can walk to work. They don't have to commute. And this, in fact, was practiced in China earlier in previous decades. They have also abandoned it, where workers were given housing in areas where they were actually working. And we used to see this in our childhood, pictures and images of thousands of people bicycling to work or walking to work. Even in a city like Bombay, a World Bank study showed that more than 60% of the population either walks to work or cycles to work. So, but the infrastructure, the road infrastructure, is not geared to help them. In fact, it is geared towards supporting 3% of the population who uses private motorized transport. So, urban planning is also very important to change our transportation culture, along with, of course, providing more public transport, discouraging or taxing private transport, and those kind of things. So, this is my view, but there is some evidence for it also. The move towards electric transport is not really going to be very useful, because you may be reducing emissions from the vehicles, but you're still producing the energy for that somewhere else. And in many countries where they are shifting to electric vehicles, the energy for that is still produced using fossil fuels. So if that you don't change it there at the source, then there is really not much change that can come about through electric vehicles. Thank you, Sneha. This is again very good question. So, in fact, some of our faculty in IDP are trying to work on decentralized climate action plans, not just at the state level, but even at the district level, or even Devasmita herself here proposes to develop a plan even at the sub-district level, at the block level. So, uh, decentralization can help in certain ways, because it is easier to get a consensus about the risks and uncertainties. It is easier to get a consensus about the strategies of adaptation and transformation. At the level of decentralization, we can also get more granular information for addressing different kinds of risks, and to convince people to change to a different method of manufacturing or livelihood or income generation or consumption, because you have a better understanding of what kind of constraints they face to change over to a cropping pattern. For example, if you have a national level strategy of cropping pattern, it's not going to work, because the weather patterns, the soil type, the water availability, the food preferences are all very different. So you can make these strategies much more customized, keeping in mind local needs, local inequalities, local constraints, barriers, and so on. And therefore, the transformation approach, the pathways to transformation approach, starts at the local level and tries to scale up to higher levels. Having said that, um, because climate change is such a huge problem, it cannot be solved only at the decentralized or local level, because you do need a lot of investment, a lot of research, a lot of scientific research, a lot of technology development, which we may not be able to do at the local level, because it requires a huge amount of resources. So that is why we talk about cross scale linkages, but focusing on co-production of knowledge between different levels, and focusing on more participation and consultation at the local level with people who are actually affected by climate change.
Yes. So second last question.
Yeah, Chintan, yeah, thanks. I think this is a topic that must have been covered earlier, land and land use change, because I'll just give you a couple of examples. So, one, land use land cover, as you know, is very closely linked to climate change, and it's been recognized by IPCC and other scientists in scientific reports as a key contributor to climate change. One important way is that the places which have forests or vegetation, if you convert the land use to urban to urbanization, to urban development, to buildings and so on, so you are reducing the forest cover. That means the you are reducing the role of forests in mitigating climate change, in absorbing carbon. Of course, other ways in which land use affects climate change is also through what we call as heat island effects. So in concretized areas, we have these heat islands that develop. They also emit a lot of energy. They emit a lot of. They contribute to heat. They contribute to emissions by producing using energy and so on. So land use, and of course there are also ways in which we can think of land use which takes over water bodies. So in Chennai, in Bombay, in other places, on the one hand, they obstruct. These water bodies used to absorb excess flows during extreme precipitation events. So that function is disabled when there is encroachment on these water bodies. Also, but we know that if you create artificial irrigation, for example, on land which is forest, you destroy the forest and put in place a reservoir that can, as Professor Subimal Ghosh's work and others' work have shown, um, uh, interfere with the land atmosphere moisture feedback mechanisms, and contribute to extreme events. So there are so many different ways in which land and land use contribute to climate change, but these are just two or three examples that I've given.
Yes. So, Professor, this is the last question.
Yeah. So, is it possible that while trying to mitigate a hazard, say drought, a new natural or anthropic hazard gets triggered in another place? This is Miss Sushma from PSG. Yeah. So this I have given explained earlier how while mitigating we can while adapting we can adversely impact on mitigation goals. Like if you use early air conditioners, you are actually contributing to emissions, not contributing to mitigation. But here, I think the concept of mitigation is used in terms of reducing the impact of a hazard, right? Reducing the risk from a hazard drought. So, if, for example, so using your example of drought, if you want to prevent the impact of that drought in terms of yield or productivity, okay, or in terms of employment, uh, overall impact on agriculture, or even on water availability. So, what can we do? How can it trigger hazards in other places? So that is the example that I was given earlier, where if you create artificial irrigation schemes, okay, to mitigate the effect of a drought, so that can actually affect the supply of moisture to the atmosphere, and that can trigger uh, uh, rainfall, extreme rain events in other parts of a country or a world. Likewise, we have seen again, some of our research have shown this, that the uh, reduction of forests in the western Ghats of India actually creates droughts in Tamil Nadu, okay, on the eastern coast. So, and there's been a lot of controversy about the Western Ghats forestry because a lot of people depended on it as well. Likewise, there are examples of mitigating flood hazards by building these retainer walls, and we have seen that not only in India but in many other countries in the world, including in Japan, Vietnam, other places, that they just cause flooding somewhere else. okay, in other parts. And we've seen this with also sea walls. So in Kerala is a good example where there are hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of sea walls, and they have actually triggered uh, um, flooding elsewhere along the coast, and they have also triggered coastal erosion in other parts. So yeah, definitely it happens. We can't hear you, Devasmita.
So we have another last question.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah. So can you suggest examples of how transformational approaches could be applied to a sector such as agriculture or fisheries? So generally, we while transformational approaches can be applied to particular sectors like agriculture or fisheries, in general, we try to take a more geographical approach, because we want to be more use a more systems approach, a more holistic approach. So if we are looking at agriculture, reducing agriculture vulnerability through transformation, or fisheries vulnerability to transformation, so you cannot look at fisheries only or agriculture only, right? You have to look at the markets, you have to look at the economic system, you have to look at the technologies being used, you have to look at the impact of fisheries not only from climate change but from destruction of wetlands or mangroves, from urban impact of urbanization on pollution. So it essentially we have to look at so if some of you who have been reading the about the farmers protests in North India, for example, there have been a number of articles that have emerged about how we need to look at it not purely in terms of prices, but how to integrate it with climate change impacts on agriculture there also, and how the protests are triggered not just by what is happening in the economic sphere or in the policy sphere, but also there is this cascading crisis, cascading vulnerability coming from many other factors, including from climate change. So, if you want to take a transformational approach, you have to look at all the different aspects and components that impinge on that particular sector, and not just look at it in an isolated manner.
yes. So thank you, Professor, for your insightful talk. I'll take some comments from YouTube, which we are getting. Thank you, Professor, for good, interesting
Thank,
topic and explanation.
yeah, thank you for all those very interesting questions. Thank you for also the comments.
Yes, sir. So thank you all, and thank you, Professor. I would like to request our participants to kindly fill the feedback form provided below in the YouTube box. And now I would like to welcome Professor Swadhantra Pratap Singh, our e-school coordinator. We welcome you, sir. Now I would like to hand over the session for the closing session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Desita. So just let me share the. So the slides are visible. Desita, can you confirm?
Not yet, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, it's visible. Not in full screen. Yes.
So thank you, Desmita. So it was really nice 9 lectures. So on the behalf of IIT Bombay and IDP Climate Studies, I express my heartfelt thanks to first DST, because it's possible because of the support of the DST, and I also thankful to our special guest, Dr. Akhilesh Gupta from DST, and he was during the inauguration, and he has given a very good and informative talks, like how DST have invested a lot for the India climate change program, and our this IDP climate studies also supported by the DST, so we are very grateful to them. And also our convener, Professor Suvimal Ghosh, because of his advice, we will able to run this school. So during this 10 days, we had wonderful lectures. So I want to thank our speakers. So basically, we have designed to give in three major area the climate impact, and the talk was given by Professor Eldo, Professor Biswal, and Professor Singh. And then there was climate vulnerability and assessment, which was the talks from Professor Rajasankaran, Professor Karmakar, and Rajsekharan. They have given wonderful talks on these topics. And then the last in the adaptation, mitigation, and policy, Professor Banerjee, Professor Rao, and today Professor Sarthi have given very informative lectures. So we really thankful to all the speakers, and we have the links. So I think it will also email. We will email to all the speakers. They already all the participants. They already have that. So please go through these recorded lectures. They are available on YouTube, so you can go through that. And at last, I really like to thank our participants. So we had almost 1,000 registered participants for this e-school, and without their participation, it's really it's not going to be possible to organize these events. And at last, I would like to thank our organizing team, especially Professor Pradeep, Professor Karmakar, Shiba, Chanya, Ashwarya, Kritika, Sonali, Devismita, and Jinya for their active role organizing during the whole e-school. And at last, thank you all for to participating in this event. Thank you. Over to you, Devismita, if you want to say something and close the thing. Thank you all.
In that, in case if any of you have missed our previous lectures, you can find them in our YouTube channel, that is IDP Climate Studies, IIT Bombay. So anytime you can watch. And thank you everyone. Thank you our viewers and participants and guest speakers. So, sir,
Thank you.
Can we
Yeah, we
call
could
up our
close.
team once on the screen?
Yes, sure.
Shiba.
Hi.
Yes, over to you, Shiba.
Okay, over to me. Oh God. Okay.
Parthasarathy, you are muted. Yes.
No, I'm not muted.
Yes, sir. Now we can hear you.
Okay, I was just telling all of you, and especially Professor Satantra Pratap Singh, first outing as a coordinator. It's been very successful, and thanks to all of you, also
Thank you.
Shiva and
Thank you.
Kritika and Zinia, Devasmita, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you,
We
sir.
really had a lot of fun backstage organizing all this.
Okay.
Even though
Virtual
we are not
backstage.
physically present with each other, but yeah,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
was a great learning experience as
Yeah.
well.
Yes, yes. Thank you
So,
all.
Thank
sir, we are getting another comment from Nigeria. I'll just show.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
Yeah, I think he's a university professor
Thank
in
you for your,
Nigeria.
that's very, very good to know. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think this is the advantage that we have from the conducting it online, that we are able to get participants from around the world.
Yes.
Yes, very
Yes.
true.
Yeah. All right then.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll log out. Huh? Thank you. Bye.
so we are closing the session then. Thank
Yeah.
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Have a
Thank
good
you,
weekend,
everyone.
all of you. Yeah.